Session. Our first speaker is Dr. Maddie Stone, who is a freelance journalist covering climate change, the environment, and green technology. Maddie has a particular interest in the metals and minerals required to fuel the green energy transition and the challenges and opportunities those resource requirements create. Her work has appeared in National Geographic, The Washington Post, The Atlantic, and more. So we're really excited to hear about your perspective, Maddie, on critical materials issues from a journalistic and policy standpoint, as well as your career arc leading into this really fascinating work that you have done as a science journalist. So please.
Well, thank you very much for saying that, Eric, and thanks for inviting me to participate today. I am really excited to be here and to get to speak with all of you about two of my favorite topics under the sun: science communication and critical minerals. And Eric just gave me a nice introduction there, but just to elaborate a little bit, I'm a freelance science journalist. I write for a number of outlets, including the ones Eric mentioned, and then also Vice, Grist, Gizmodo, and a few others. And I've been a freelancer for about a year. Before that, I was a full-time staff writer and editor at Gizmodo, which is a popular tech and science website. And while I was there, I founded Earther.com, a vertical focused on climate and environmental science and policy. So you can check that out if you're interested. And before that, I actually received a PhD from Penn's Earth and Environmental Sciences Department. So I did a bit of a career transition from science to science journalism. And I'm happy to answer any questions about that if anyone has them. So these days, as Eric said, I mainly cover environmental sciences and green technology, and I've developed over the years a particularly strong interest in critical metals and minerals and the requirements, the resource requirements of the green energy transition. And I think this is a really fascinating topic because it's right at the intersection of technology and the environment. And our need for these metals and minerals is really so great and only going to become greater as the green energy transition ramps up and the world starts to build more wind and solar power and more electric cars. But another reason I love critical minerals is that I'm a sucker for a good science story. I love stories that show how the world is stranger and more complex than it seems, or that reveal how the things we tend to classify as, you know, black and white, good or bad in the narratives we tell are so often quite a bit more nuanced than that. And I think that critical minerals, by their very nature, almost defy the simple narratives we tend to see out there in the media around green technology and climate change. So I'm going to talk with you about what I see as some of the bigger kind of story arcs, narratives out there around critical minerals as a journalist who's been following this space closely for about 5 years. And I'll also talk to you about how each and every one of you as experts in the field can kind of help shape and inform those narratives and make them better. First, though, I just want to say a little bit more about science journalism to make sure we are all on the same page. Having interviewed hundreds of scientists, I know that most scientists don't interact with journalists on a regular basis, but I hope at the end of this, you'll feel a little bit more empowered to do so. So I just wanted to start with a simple definition: what is a science journalist? And I think to understand that, you really have to understand what a journalist is, and that's really quite simple. So the most simple definition I can think of for a journalist is someone who seeks out the truth and reports it. That's it. It's not someone who writes op-eds in the New York Times or who goes on a CNN roundtable to riff on the news of the day, although people who do those things are often journalists too in their day job. But a journalist is distinct. It's someone who's seeking facts and reporting those facts to the public. And another important thing to say is that a journalist doesn't need to be a writer. There are photojournalists, video journalists, all sorts of multimedia journalists out there. So that's all that a journalist is. And once you understand that, I think the definition of a science journalist kind of falls into place. It's a person who seeks facts and truth about science and reports it. And I just elaborated a little on that definition here. So I'm describing a science journalist as someone who seeks and reports the truth about scientific research, scientific institutions, how science shapes and is shaped by policy, society, culture, etc. So the bread and butter of what many science journalists do is sort of translating scientific studies for the public. And I think that is the aspect of a science journalist's work that most people are most familiar with. But that's not all that science journalists do. So they can also be doing investigative work, looking into power and corruption in scientific institutions. They can be science policy journalists, somebody who maybe lives in Washington and reports on important bills being debated on Capitol Hill, or they can be someone who writes about how science is filtered through the lens of popular culture, or maybe some combination of all of those. So the point is, science journalists are quite diverse in their interests and expertise. Another point I want to make about science journalists is, maybe this seems obvious, but I find that this is often not obvious when talking with scientists and actually all kinds of audiences, is that science journalists are not science's PR squad. In my experience, there tends to be a lot of confusion among scientists about sort of the difference between journalists and public relations. And so the difference, very simply put, between PR and journalism is that public relations is intended to shape powerful actors and institutions' public image, generally to portray them in as positive a light as possible. Journalism is about holding powerful actors and institutions publicly accountable, and often by saying things that they don't want said. And you might wonder how that's relevant to telling stories about science. You know, if I'm writing about a new astronomical finding, I'm mostly going to be talking about how telescopes work, how to interpret spectroscopic data. That's not a story about holding powerful people accountable necessarily. And so this is true. A lot of science journalism is about translating and explaining complex things for the public to understand, and not necessarily exposing shady actors and their nefarious motives. But the principle that science isn't PR still applies, and it still forms sort of a foundation of how a science journalist versus, say, a science press release writer at a university will approach a story. So when an important new study comes out, for example, the press release writer is going to talk to the scientists who did the work and present their explanation for the results in as clear and compelling a way as possible. They're trying to write something that's going to be picked up in the press because it's kind of eye-catching and exciting. A science journalist is going to talk to the scientists who did the work, but also in the ideal situation, they're going to do their own independent research and speak with outside experts in the field who can comment on not just how exciting the findings are, but the important caveats and limitations associated with those findings. And rather than presenting the work as sort of a breakthrough that changes everything, a good science journalist's job is to show the public how a new finding matters in the context of all the work that came before it and all the limitations associated with it. So to give the public a sense of how this deepens our understanding of a certain topic, but not to kind of sensationalize it or blow it out of proportion. So that's just an important distinction I wanted to make. Next, who can be a science journalist? And the answer to this one is quite easy. Anyone can. I personally came into science journalism as a way of escaping academia. I was getting a PhD here at Penn in the environmental sciences department. And I would say about 2 years into my program, I started to feel like, you know, working at a lab bench all day is fun and interesting, but this doesn't really feel like what I want to be doing for the rest of my life. And actually, my favorite part of the entire scientific process is writing up the abstract of the papers where I get to succinctly summarize the results. And my advisor thought this was very strange, but he encouraged me to pursue alternatives to a traditional academic path. And so while I was in grad school, I started blogging about science. I had a personal WordPress blog, and I developed a little following on social media, mostly consisting of other scientists, bloggers, and people who were interested in the topics I was writing about, which were microbes and soils and things that I studied. And then when I was in my final year, my PhD program and working on my dissertation, I picked up a part-time job in Penn's newsroom, working with the 2 full-time science writers as part of the university news team. And so while that was PR, not journalism. It did help me build a lot of the foundational skills that I use every day in terms of conducting interviews, crafting a succinct news story, the back and forth of working with an editor, and it helped me develop a small portfolio of clippings, which I was then able to show to journalistic outlets to get some of my first freelance gigs. And so then I started doing a bit of freelance writing during the last few months before defending my dissertation in 2014. And then after defending, I just sort of went whole hog into that world. And after a few months as a freelancer, I got a part-time job at Gizmodo, which eventually became a full-time job. And I was there for 4 years before heading out into the freelance world again. So that brief story of how I got into journalism is certainly not the only path into science journalism. I know some great science journalists who came from academic backgrounds, but I also know some really great ones who were English majors or liberal arts majors, or who went to journalism school kind of to study journalism more generally before deciding to specialize in science writing. So you can start anywhere and you don't need to have a PhD to be a good science journalist. And toward the end of my talk, I'll offer some resources for those of you interested in getting more into science communication or even science journalism. And I'm also happy to answer any follow-up questions about that. Okay, so that was my very brief primer on science journalism. And now I want to move on to science narratives, which you heard about quite a bit in the last talk as well. But just as a brief kind of refresher, narratives are the stories we tell about science. And so these narratives can be, exciting, they can be scary, they can be true or untrue, or very often somewhere in between. But whatever the narrative is, the essential purpose of it is to tell you, the consumer of the media, what to think about an issue. And so in science journalism, narratives often rely on published research, on scientists' opinions and testimonials, maybe on powerful imagery. Say if you're reporting a story on an oil spill or fires in the Amazon. And very often they also rely on people, on engaging and illustrative anecdotes and stories about people, say interviews with members of a community being impacted by a polluting factory, or maybe people who took an experimental drug. And which science narratives you are exposed to is going to depend a lot on where you receive your information. So if you're a regular reader of the magazine New Scientist, you might be exposed to different science stories and narratives than if you exclusively read the New York Times Science page. It's also possible that your main exposure to science is at the movies or from a wellness magazine or maybe from YouTube videos. So there's a large variety of ways that the public consumes information about science, which is why I think as it was put in the previous talk, there really is no general public when it comes to science and storytelling. And there's also a large swath of the public that doesn't seek out science news at all. But these people are still going to be hearing science discussed in the public sphere by politicians or on the morning weather report or by pundits on cable TV or within their families and social circles. So whole spectrum of ways the public consumes information about science. And as a result, there's a whole spectrum of different narratives out there people are going to be exposed to, and different takes that people are going to have on scientific issues. Who shapes the narrative? There are a lot of people involved in shaping science narratives. Obviously, science journalists play an important role. So do scientists themselves, particularly those who are kind of active in engaging with the media and the public. Politicians, particularly those who have an interest in issues that intersect with health, environment, and science and society. Activists, celebrities, the list goes on. Lots of different types of people can shape public narratives around science. The truth is that just about anyone can help build a narrative around science, regardless of whether they have credentials, and narratives sort of take on a life of their own once they're out there. And so that's why, as my last bucket of folks who shape science narratives, I would say anyone loud enough. And unfortunately, the fact that anyone loud enough can shape science narratives, regardless of their information level, often leads to people with what I'm going to politely term low levels of expertise and information having an outsized impact on the conversation. So just a couple examples of that come to mind. Probably the best / worst one are the tweets our current president regularly issues displaying his confusion about how the weather works. This one from 2017 is about how global warming can't possibly be real because the East Coast was experiencing some cold weather. Now, of course, that's completely ridiculous, but this feeds into a narrative that climate skeptics and their allies have sort of been spinning for decades, that every cold weather event disproves global warming. I also put up a more recent tweet by someone who has a somewhat higher level of scientific credibility, Tesla CEO Elon Musk, who is not a pandemic expert, weighing in on the coronavirus pandemic with a very incorrect prediction about the course of the disease. And this tweet, of course, fed into a narrative that Fox News and other right-wing media have been circulating over the last few months, that this pandemic has been overblown by the mainstream media and things will just kind of take care of themselves. So the fact that people with not a lot of great information, but who have a large organic audience can play such a big role in shaping science narratives makes it especially important for subject matter experts to also be engaging with the public. So we have credible sources of information pushing back when disinformation gets out there. Okay, so getting to the real reason all of you are here in this seminar series, critical minerals or critical materials. So what is the narrative in the media about them? And I think there was some great stuff said on this earlier, and I'm happy to hear all of your thoughts when we get to the Q&A. But I'm just going to speak from my own perspective as a member of the news media and as someone who's been covering critical minerals for about 5 years. And I guess the first thing I would say is that I would argue that there is not one big overarching narrative when it comes to critical minerals. I would argue that, in fact, it's still fairly unusual to see this issue discussed in mainstream news. And I think that gap represents an opportunity for each of you to help shape the conversation. But I will run through some narratives I've seen growing out there in the media, as well as in advocacy circles and among politicians. And as a preface, I should say that these narratives are something of caricatures. They're through lines in stories that are often a lot more complex and nuanced than what I've boiled them down to. And as a second preface, I'll say that I'm excited that some of the more positive narratives around rare earths and sort of the technological wonder of these metals were brought up earlier. That is a great narrative that I did not include below because it's not one I see in the media so frequently today. Most of the narratives that I see out there are a bit more focused on the challenges and the problems posed by critical minerals, and whether those are geopolitical, environmental, and how we can overcome those challenges. Okay, so first narrative, one you're probably all familiar with, is this narrative of scarcity. So we're going to run out of resources. This is kind of a favorite media narrative about a lot of natural resources, and I would say it is a key narrative that is out there when it comes to a lot of critical minerals. And there's very good reason for that. Many of these metals and minerals, as you know, are geographically concentrated in a few places on Earth and are only supplied to the global market by a handful of mines. There's been a lot of concern over the past decade about rare earth supplies and our reliance on just a few key mines to furnish most of the world's supply of something that plays an essential role in modern technology. And more recently, a flurry of projections have come out showing the expected rise in demand for a host of critical minerals due to the green energy transition. So this is just a paper published earlier in this year in Science, and it reported, let me make sure I get the numbers right, increases in demand for materials between 2015 and 2060 of 87,000% for electric vehicle batteries, 1,000% for wind power, and 3,000% for solar cells and photovoltaics. So huge increase in demand for these critical metals and minerals coming down the pipeline. The World Bank Group put out a report in May reaching a very similar conclusion. It focused a little bit more on battery metals, such as graphite, lithium, and cobalt, and how those would need to increase over the coming decades in order to meet climate targets. Kind of the top line conclusion of this report was that over 3 billion tons of minerals and metals will be needed to deploy enough wind, solar, renewable energy, and energy storage to limit global warming to 2 degrees Celsius. Okay, so this narrative of scarcity is very much grounded in some important facts and studies, and it's kind of been building up in the media over the years. So this is a headline from a New York Times article from 2010 discussing how the United States at the time was perceived to be too dependent on China for its rare earth supply. The story quotes experts in dysprosium mining, saying that a shortage of this heavy rare earth was essentially right around the corner. In part, this concern was fueled by China lowering its export quotas on rare earth elements, which briefly caused prices to skyrocket on the global market. Recently, there have been a lot of stories about a looming sort of cobalt supply crunch. The headline I put up here is from a Forbes article in 2018. And then recently, there's also been some coverage addressing the bigger concern now being voiced by certain members of the US Congress and even the White House, that the United States could be vulnerable to any number of critical mineral supply shortages. So back in February, the USGS, the US Geological Survey, put out a report identifying a short list of 23 minerals that pose the greatest supply risk to US manufacturers based on our dependence on foreign supplies and the likelihood of a disruption. And so I wrote a story about that for Medium's technology site, 10, and the headline the editors chose to go with, I would say, very much plays into that scarcity narrative. So the flip side of scarcity is, well, what are we going to do about it? If our need for these metals and minerals is so great, how do we fill that need? And in most cases right now and in the immediate future, the answer is that we are going to need to ramp up mining, which sort of leads to my second big narrative in the media around critical minerals, is that they're deeply environmentally destructive and also can be very harmful to humans. And again, as with the scarcity narrative, there's a lot of truth to this. There are well-documented environmental and human rights abuses associated with mining and refining of cobalt and rare earth metals. A lot of lithium extraction occurs in the so-called lithium triangle in South America, and there's been some really good reporting and documentation in recent years of how this is fueling conflict with local and indigenous communities, particularly over the large water usage of these mining operations. And increasingly, environmental advocacy organizations have been sounding the alarm about how mining for a whole host of metals is going to ramp up due to the green energy transition, and that if we don't put the proper regulatory safeguards in place now, this could have really negative impacts on many communities around the world. So this article headline I'm showing here is something of a, I think, a classic rare earths article published by the BBC in 2015. It was one of the first articles, I think, to really telegraph to a broad audience the severe environmental toll of rare earth mining in Inner Mongolia. And so that was a really powerful use of visual storytelling, because they got all these really great photos of this mine and this toxic waste tailing site associated with these rare earth mines. As I said, environmental and human rights NGOs have played an instrumental role in shaping this narrative around the destructive nature of critical minerals. This is a report I covered for Gizmodo in 2018 from the International Institute for Sustainable Development. It was warning about conflicts and human rights abuses that could be exacerbated due to a ramp up in mining to fuel the green energy transition. And this is just an example of some reporting that's come out on the cobalt issue. This was a great piece from the Washington Post several years back, exploring the conditions at artisanal cobalt mines in the Congo. And so this was I felt like a really powerful example of critical mineral storytelling that really focused on the human dimension of the problem. So the Post sent a reporter out to these cobalt mines and took a lot of photographs of workers, did a lot of interviews with workers and their families, and really tried to put a human face on where these metals that are so essential to our daily lives are coming from, and who is bearing the burden of bringing them to us. There was another report in a similar vein to that International Institute for Sustainable Development one that I wrote about for Gizmodo in 2019. This report, I believe it was commissioned by Earthworks, which is an environmental NGO. It was essentially warning about how the clean energy transition could fuel a mining boom when it comes to batteries and what some of the consequences of that would be. And it had some projections about how much we're going to need to ramp up lithium, cobalt, nickel production, and how concerning it is the conditions at some of the mines where this production is occurring today. And so this study's findings played into that we're running out of metals narrative. We're going to have to ramp up production very quickly. But the real concern of the authors was that we're going to need to be very careful about how we do that so as not to exacerbate a host of existing problems. One example it keyed in on was a nickel refinery in Australia that was closed some years back after it was found to be dumping toxic wastewater into the Great Barrier Reef. So just a few examples of some of the environmental and labor concerns with critical minerals mining that have been voiced recently by environmental human rights NGOs, and also how they've been covered in the media. So while I personally think it is important to raise the alarm about how a future mining boom or existing mining operations could exacerbate environmental challenges and conflicts, this narrative that clean energy requires a lot of mining has also been used far more cynically, I would say, by climate naysayers and the fossil fuel industry to sort of build this argument that actually renewable energy is just as bad for the planet as oil, coal, and gas, and that all of these pro-renewable environmentalists are really just a bunch of hypocrites. And probably the most poignant example of this version of the narrative I can point you toward is a clip from Planet of the Humans, which is a recent climate documentary executive produced by Michael Moore, came out in April. If you haven't seen it, you might have heard of it. It's quite controversial. It was purportedly about exposing the lies and deceptions of big green organizations when it comes to climate change and renewable energy. And the film has gotten a lot of criticism, particularly for its portrayal of renewables as wildly inefficient and destructive, which many experts have said rely on outdated information and misleading statistics. But there's one clip in particular that I think really epitomizes this narrative that renewable energy is just as bad as fossil fuels because of the minerals and the mining needed to furnish it. So I'm just going to see if I can play that clip for you. Oh, no, we got to jump back. Sorry, folks, I thought I had the right spot. Okay, right around here. Okay, so you kind of get the idea there. Basically portraying renewable energy as this big dirty industry that relies on a ton of mining. And so you can feel however you want to feel about that, but you can see how this video uses a variety of storytelling devices, powerful imagery of destructive mining operations, distressing music, and some so-called expert testimonial, which I didn't really play too much of, but to kind of build a narrative that renewables are really just terrible for the planet. And it's been somewhat effective. This video has racked up millions and millions of views since its release in April on Earth Day, and fossil fuel industry groups like the Heartland Institute have been sort of parroting its claims about the extractive nature of renewable energy nonstop. So that kind of brings me to my next critical minerals narrative, which comes out of the question if we're going to need far more renewable energy and more of these metals for all kinds of technology in order to fight climate change, but there is such a heavy toll of mining. Are we basically in a catch-22? Are we going to have to mine our way out of the climate crisis? And increasingly, environmentalists and politicians on the left are saying, no, we just need to recycle a lot more. And as all of you know better than me, there's a lot of truth to that. We're not doing a great job recycling many of these metals today. Here is another International Institute for Sustainable Development report that came out a little over a year ago, making the case for more recycling of cobalt and lithium, both key metals in electric car batteries, reporting that less than 5% of cobalt is recycled at the end of its life today, and rates of lithium recovery are virtually negligible. And so you can check out the report online. This is a little screenshot from an interactive web page they put together illustrating sort of how more recycling can move us from a linear economy of extraction, manufacturing, use, and disposal into a more sustainable circular economy. And so this narrative that we need to recycle critical minerals a lot more than we're doing, obviously this is something scientists have been thinking about a long time, but I think it's only very recently started to gain a lot more prominence both in the media and among kind of very influential politicians. And for me, that was reflected in the fact that it made its way actually into several Democratic presidential climate and energy platforms released back in the fall and winter. So Bernie Sanders had an extensive and probably one of the most ambitious climate change platforms out there, which among other things called for establishing a nationwide materials recycling program in order to build wind turbine solar panels, cars, and batteries with as many recycled materials as possible. Washington Governor Jay Inslee, when he was running as the so-called climate candidate, had many climate plans, including a 100% clean energy plan that had a section on zeroing out transit emissions by 2030, also pointed to the need for more battery recycling. So more mentions than we have ever seen in presidential campaign platforms before. And better lithium battery recycling even has gotten on Congress's radar for what I believe is the first time recently. So there was a bill introduced in the Senate back in February by Maine Independent Angus King that I wrote about for Grist a few months back, the Battery and Critical Mineral Recycling Act of 2020. So this bill called on Congress to dole out $150 million over the next 5 years to support research and innovation in battery recycling approaches. It's unclear whether the bill is going to move forward anytime soon. Congress has obviously been more focused on its pandemic response recently, but recycling advocates I spoke with at the time saw it as an encouraging sign that Congress was starting to pay more attention to the issue and as a potential springboard for even more ambitious legislation in the future. Last example I wanted to bring up on the recycling scene for now, in February at what I think was like the dozenth Democratic presidential debate in Las Vegas, Elizabeth Warren actually got a question about critical minerals. So the debate moderator asked her how she reconciled her plan to ban drilling and mining on public lands with the fact that we're going to need a lot more of critical metals like lithium and copper specifically for renewable energy. And she had a pretty nuanced and I would say savvy answer to that question. She said that, and I have the quote here, she said, "I think we should stop all new drilling and mining on public lands and all offshore drilling. If we need to make exceptions because there are specific minerals that we've got to have access to, we locate those and we do it in a way that is not just about the profits of giant industries, but in a way that is sustainable for the environment." So to my knowledge, this is the first time critical minerals came up during a presidential debate, and I wrote a piece for Grist kind of dissecting her response and why I felt it was significant that she acknowledged that we might need more mining in order to meet the resource demands of the green energy transition. I also reached out to some progressive advocacy organizations for comment for this story, and Earthworks in particular had an interesting response. They essentially didn't like Warren's response at all. The part I quoted here is from a senior policy advisor there, basically saying that there are better ways to meet our growing mineral demand than new mining. Public and private sector investment has spurred innovation in recycling and reuse. Clean tech companies, recyclers, and manufacturers have market power to demand responsibly sourced minerals. So that just gives you a sense of sort of the position that some of these green NGOs are staking out on this issue. Let's not focus on more mining. Let's focus all our energy in the recycling basket. Okay, next narrative I am starting to see more and more of out there in left-leaning circles is that wars over critical minerals are going to kind of be the 21st century version of the oil wars. And by the oil wars, I mean wars that are being started by wealthy countries, transnational corporations seeking to gain control over another country's strategic resources. And the clearest example I can think of this in recent times has to do with Bolivia's recent political crisis and a theory that circulated out there that the United States orchestrated a coup in Bolivia to gain control of the country's lithium. So brief backstory here is Bolivia is a fairly poor South American nation that has a lot of mineral resources, including the world's largest lithium resources in its high alpine salt flats. And until recently, the country was governed by Evo Morales, a socialist who rose to power in part due to his promise to make the country wealthy and prosperous by developing and commercializing that lithium. And while historically most of the wealth from resource extraction in Bolivia has flown overseas, Morales and his government early on said that they were going to embark on this state-run lithium development strategy. It was going to be developed by Bolivians for Bolivians. And that effort faced numerous setbacks, and the country did get a few pilot plants up and running for lithium and battery production over Morales's decade-long tenure. But close to the end of his time in office, he decided the country needed some help. So he inked a deal with a German company that had the backing of the German government to use some new technology to extract lithium more efficiently from these brines. The deal turned out to be wildly unpopular with locals who felt like it was a betrayal of the state-run strategy. And so last fall, local pressure prompted Morales to cancel the deal. But it just so happened that around the time that he canceled that deal, he was dealing with a national political crisis. He had just run one re-election, but the results had been called into contest. And a few days after backing out of the German lithium deal, Morales was forced to step down by the military. So, unaware of all that context, I just very briefly gave you, some internet sleuthers saw that Morales had cut and then canceled a lithium deal shortly before his government collapsed, and they went, aha, this was a lithium coup. This was the United States doing what it always does and interfering with other countries' governments to gain control of a resource. And so that idea kind of sounded credible, and the narrative started to make the rounds in left-leaning news sites. And after Evo Morales fled the country, he even went on RT News, Russian state media, and did an interview where he basically said, without any evidence to back it up, yep, it was a lithium coup. So last winter, I wrote an article for the technology site Protocol explaining why this was very likely a false narrative and why Bolivia has had such a difficult time commercializing its lithium all these years. So that coup narrative kind of fizzled out some months back. And then the whole thing was revived earlier this month when Elon Musk responded on Twitter to someone accusing him of orchestrating a lithium coup in Bolivia with "we will coup whoever we want." So there's no evidence that Musk or Tesla have ever had any interest in Bolivia's lithium, and in all likelihood, Tesla CEO was engaging in one of his favorite pastimes, being a Twitter troll. But getting back to who controls the narrative, it's another example of how anyone with enough clout and followers can kind of amplify a story, whether or not it's true. So that is one version of the narrative that we're going to see these future resource wars fought over critical minerals. There's another version of this narrative, a slightly different one, playing out on the political right. In that case, it's less about secretly orchestrated coups and US imperialism and more about how our own reliance on critical minerals as a nation creates national security vulnerabilities. So we can see that narrative at play in an executive order the Trump administration released in 2017, calling for a new federal strategy to ensure reliable supplies of critical minerals. So that order starts by talking about how the US is heavily reliant on imports of certain commodities. And then just a little pull quote here, that this dependence creates a strategic vulnerability for the economy and the military to adverse foreign government action. So drawing a very clear link there between our reliance on foreign mineral supplies and security vulnerabilities. So the order goes on to call for identifying the most essential minerals to our economy and national security and developing a strategy to essentially onshore the entire supply chain for those minerals from mining to product manufacturing. So that order has been followed by a sort of a steady drumbeat of federal government moves to make good on it, including publication of an official federal strategy to onshore supplies of critical minerals in 2019, and several bills in Congress aiming to strengthen America's so-called mineral security, most notably a bill led by Alaskan Republican Senator Lisa Murkowski. So all of this Republican-led interest in shoring up domestic mineral supplies in the name of national security has had its critics on the left. In particular, environmental groups have put the plan on blast because it calls for essentially fast-tracking mining projects on public lands and speeding along environmental review processes or even waiving those processes. So a number of green groups see it as little more than an excuse for rolling back environmental regulations, which, to be fair, has been kind of one of the Trump administration's top priorities since day one. So this is just a press release from the Sierra Club shortly after the critical mineral strategy was published in 2019. Group's executive director saying this dangerous plan puts mining companies first before the needs of communities and workers. Okay, so that was a lot. So narratives around critical mineral supply shortages, around the environmental and human toll of critical minerals mining, and around the broader geopolitical ramifications of our mineral needs. And the last but not least narrative on my list is Silicon Valley's favorite critical minerals narrative, which is that innovation is going to solve everything. So a number of high-tech companies have recently begun to recognize vulnerabilities in their own supply chains produced by their reliance on critical minerals, whether that's concern over actual supply shortages or perhaps PR vulnerabilities in the sense that they don't wish to have their brands associated with harmful mining practices. And I would say no one has really attempted to address this problem as systematically and ambitiously as Apple, whose iPhones and computers contain literally dozens of different metals and minerals sourced from all over the planet. So in 2017, Apple made a big splash when it announced that it hoped to one day stop mining the earth for new materials altogether, largely by the use of new and innovative recycling techniques. And a cornerstone of its strategy is this recycling robot that I put up here. And so this is a robot called Daisy that Apple developed that can disassemble something like 200 iPhones per hour down to their individual components, and Apple can then ship those components off to various recycling partners for material recovery. So I've been following Apple's progress very closely, but somewhat skeptically because Apple is very secretive and it puts out these yearly environmental reports that are kind of tailor-made to make it look as good as possible. And last year I did this sort of investigative explainer for Gizmodo, where I tried to ask, okay, if Apple really truly wants to end mining, what is it going to need to do? And then I compared that with what we know about the progress Apple has made on various material recycling fronts to date. And the short answer is that Apple will need to do a lot more than it has done so far. So it's attacked very kind of low-hanging fruit on its path toward material circularity, including using more recycled tin in its logic boards, and more recycled aluminum for its MacBook enclosures. The recycled aluminum is actually shavings of aluminum produced during its manufacturing process. So it's a little bit of a stretch to even call that recycling. It's essentially a way for Apple to produce less waste while it's manufacturing. And essentially my conclusion there was that Apple is going to need to get a lot more aggressive on R&D, especially for things like rare earths and cobalt. So metals that don't already have well-established recycling methodologies and supply chains. And that ultimately it may need to kind of rethink the capitalist model of endless growth, because of course, if you're selling more devices every year, it's going to be very hard to produce enough recycled materials to meet your demand. So that's Apple and how it's attempting to kind of innovate its way out of a critical mineral shortage. Another approach some companies are taking is to say, well, if we live in a world of finite resources, how can we make the resources we've got last as long as possible? And that's an idea that has driven a number of EV companies and battery makers to work toward innovating extremely long-lived electric car batteries, these so-called million-mile batteries. So I had a story out in Grist just last month following a flurry of announcements by companies like Tesla and General Motors indicating that they had million-mile batteries waiting in the wings right around the corner for their next electric vehicle model. And for comparison, the average electric car battery today is warranted to last about 100,000 miles. So if this is true, it's really a huge technological leap forward. But as is the case with Apple, there are reasons to be skeptical about all the hype. So I spoke with a number of battery experts who essentially said they're going to need to see these batteries in order to believe them. A few told me that while companies might technically be able to spin their batteries as lasting 1 million miles, in reality, the performance is likely to degrade substantially before they reach that mark. So again, exciting idea that could reduce our dependence on virgin mined minerals, but by making the ones we have last longer, but still a lot of questions to be answered. Okay, so that was a lot of information I just threw at you, and I'd love for you to ask me questions on it. Last thing I just wanted to briefly discuss before we get there is how scientists, subject matter experts can help improve the narratives that are out there about your field of study. So just a few ideas for how you can start engaging with the public more, honing your science communication skills. A great one that I think was mentioned earlier is giving a public talk on your research. You will be amazed by how much you're going to be forced to boil things down when you're speaking to the public versus your colleagues. Just a few local events that are always in need of experts willing to speak. The Philly Science Festival, which happens in April. The Franklin Institute has a regularly occurring science speaker series run by actually another former Penn Earth Science grad student. And the Penn program in environmental humanities is a really great interdisciplinary program that hosts a range of events on climate and society. And I'm sure there are a lot more local opportunities, not an exhaustive list. Second, which I know we just talked about a little bit, writing an op-ed for a newspaper or an online magazine. That's another great way to practice public communication skills in a somewhat different format, and can really be an excellent opportunity to weigh in with your expertise when there is a narrative out there that you feel is simplistic or misleading that's kind of making the rounds in the news and on social media. You can start a blog. No better way to kind of hone your science communication skills than to practice regularly. And I quite frankly don't think I would be where I am today if I hadn't spent a few years in grad school just churning out the WordPress blogs into the ether. Even if you've only got a dozen dedicated readers, there is a sense of kind of accomplishment in blogging regularly, and your writing skills will absolutely improve over time. Getting active on Twitter. So some people love Twitter, some people hate it, but regardless of how you feel about it, I can tell you this, it is where all the journalists are hanging out all day when they're not reporting stories. I cannot tell you how many times I've gotten a really critical source for a story by putting out a public call on Twitter. So if you want to make yourself more available to folks in the media, getting on Twitter is a great way to do so. It's also a great forum for sharing your blog, finding other like-minded scientists and science communicators, of which there are a lot out there. For the grad students specifically, I wanted to flag ComSciCon. I really can't recommend this enough. It's a science communication workshop for graduate students. It was started about 7 years back by students in Harvard's astronomy department and became this 2-day event on science communication that was hosted in Cambridge every year. And in recent years, it's spread to a lot of other universities around the country. And I would not be surprised if there's one at Penn or somewhere else more locally. I attended a ComSciCon during my last year in grad school and met a bunch of journalists and other science communication professionals who I think played a really huge role in kind of giving me the confidence to embark on a career in journalism. And finally, if you are actually really serious about a career in journalism, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, AAAS, has a long-running mass media fellowship. It's an 8 or 10-week summer internship where science grad students are placed in newsrooms around the country to learn the nuts and bolts of science reporting. I personally haven't done this program, but I know a lot of science journalists who came from an academic background and who credit it with essentially launching their careers in science journalism, because by the end of the program, you're going to have bylines to your name and a bunch of editor contacts who you can pitch stories to or get recommendations from. And for those who are, anyone who is really serious about journalism, there are other resources I can offer, including fellowships and master's programs, but I will leave it there now and take any questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Maddie. That was really, really stimulating and interesting to hear your perspective on all of these things. I think we can welcome questions in the chat to start. I'd really like to encourage students, postdocs to ask the first question, if possible, before we get into other members of the center. So maybe I'll dangle that out there for a minute and see if we can come up with anybody. Going once.
There are no bad questions.
Absolutely right. Okay, well, maybe I'll get things started then, and we'll see if somebody else will be willing to jump in.
Sure.
I was really interested in the idea of shaping the narrative, even back to the very beginning of your talk, and how the scientists can contribute to that. And I guess I'm wondering if you can give us examples, maybe in a positive and a negative way, about how the scientists have contributed to shaping narratives in stories that you have developed.
Sure, yeah. I mean, scientists are really absolutely critical in shaping most of the narratives that I end up writing about. Obviously, if I'm writing about a study or a scientific research topic, I'm going to rely heavily on the subject matter experts in that field in order to kind of provide me with the factual and the technical information I need and help me give me kind of an in-depth understanding of the field. But I would say more broadly than that, scientists, well, they play a lot of different roles. So on the one hand, scientists can be very helpful. I find them to be very helpful in telling me kind of when a narrative is being taken out of proportion in the media. So if there's a study that has gotten a lot of hype, maybe something not from my particular beat area, but say there's a new study on red meat and how terrible it is for you, and everyone is writing about how you eat red meat and you're going to die. I might try to speak with a number of different nutritional scientists and health experts about that claim. And the expert feedback I get can help me write a much more nuanced, caveated story that kind of brings things back down to earth and tries to steer the narrative back in a more factual direction. So scientists can be really helpful with kind of toning the narrative down. On the other hand, there are certain issues like climate change that I would argue the public often isn't concerned enough about. And having a scientist come forward and kind of speak almost on a more emotional level about how this subject is important to them and why they're alarmed can go a really far way toward helping shape a narrative about why you should be alarmed about XYZ. So there's a lot of weight and credibility that comes with being a scientist, subject matter expert, even more so than maybe a climate activist or advocate who's out there sort of on the front lines of the advocacy sphere. Having that subject matter expert on Arctic sea ice come out and say, look, these trends are really alarming and they're going to continue to be alarming unless we do X, Y, Z, lends a lot of credibility to the conversation. So speaking out when there is something in your field, in your wheelhouse, where you as an expert can weigh in and help validate the concerns of the activists or the public who are talking about the issue, but also speaking out when you think that the narrative has taken on kind of a misleading life of its own and trying to steer that back in a better direction. And I think there's a lot of scientists who do this really well. I think one thing I noticed is that it's researchers who are a little bit more established in their careers, maybe tenured professors who tend to voice their opinions to the media the most. And I don't know, I don't have a good answer as to why that is. I imagine it has to do with concern among early career scientists about saying or doing something that could impact their future career, but it's really valuable to get more young and early career scientists into the conversation. So I'll just put that out there as a plug.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you. That's really helpful. I think it looks like Nikhil, is that how you say your name? Nikhil Chelam has a question. Can we unmute? Maybe we'll unmute you, or you can unmute yourself.
He should be unmuted now.
Okay.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, Nikhil. You want to introduce yourself and then take us through your question?
Sure. I'm just turning on my video right now. Well, okay, yeah. Sorry. Well, I'm a student in the SHATS. I'm working for the SHATS group right now as part of the CSSM Center. And I also have I have an academic background in history. I did a bachelor's degree in history. And one of the things that is kind of like a repeating narrative in a lot of my classes, and as you mentioned in your talk, is that there's a big component of the US historical narrative about like us shaping other countries' histories by the sake of controlling their resources, right? Like one of the biggest causes of the Iranian Revolution in 1976 was us trying to prevent Iran from nationalizing their oil reserves. And as you mentioned, also kind of like disputes as to whether or not Bolivia's lithium resources should be nationalized or not. And questions of US involvement. But a lot of the story is told from policymakers' perspectives. And so I was wondering how us as scientists can like kind of prevent this from happening or address this issue in the first place. And kind of to add to that, because there's also kind of this big barrier between scientific publication and actual like putting into practice, right? Like there's only so much that like a certain publication can be done, which is also mentioned in one of the previous talks about if your work has not been cited, then is it even worth having published? Mm-hmm. Right. So I was wondering, like, so someone can come up with like, sure, a novel way of separating things, but then to what extent can it be practiced because of like supply chain costs, economics, so on and so forth? It's kind of a big question, but I was wondering how much like, insight you may have into this.
Yeah, well, with the first part of your question, I assume you're kind of talking about instances in which the narrative that's out there, so you as a scientist, as a subject matter expert, see a narrative out there and you think this narrative isn't totally correct or there's some information missing and I want to contribute to that narrative. That's that's the kind of situation you're describing?
Right, because we have like this, because more often than not, the common person listens to policymakers more so than they do to like the average professor around them.
Sure.
And like kind of in this, like, take it as it will, like blind faith into whether or not this is useful or not. And
Yeah.
so this also leads to my second question that I kind of mentioned just now is like, to what extent can science advocacy make that transparent? And then also, how can we as the quote unquote experts like make
Yeah.
our own work more accessible?
Great. Okay. I think I can and try to attack that. It's a lot of great questions there. As far as the policy side of things go, I mean, this is really going to depend on your knowledge base and comfort level as a scientist speaking out on political issues. But if, as you described yourself, someone who has a background in history, maybe you see a narrative circulating out there about lithium in Bolivia or rare earths in China, and you know, some sort of geopolitical dimension to it, and you want to weigh in on it as a scientist. You know, I think it just comes back to making yourself accessible to the press. So whether that is, I know it sounds very basic, but getting on Twitter and sort of tweeting some of your thoughts as a subject matter expert, and developing an organic following of your own. You might get some journalists to follow you. Maybe they'll start reaching out to you as a source to weigh in on those kinds of stories when they're writing them. You can also go to your university press office and, you know, get familiar with the folks who cover science news there, introduce yourself, say, hey, I'm a scientist, this is my expertise. You know, I'd like to be on your radar and be someone you get in touch with when you're writing a story about XYZ, because often the press office will not only write about new topics that, you know, new research results coming out, but we'll write articles on very topical issues of the day and what kind of Penn, for instance, researchers at Penn are doing that relates to those issues. So this is not a critical minerals example, but a policy example that comes to mind recently was there was a bill introduced to Congress, and this is going to sound absolutely ridiculous, but it was a bill that would have prohibited the sitting president from deploying a nuclear weapon on a hurricane. And the reason that bill was introduced came out of some reporting by Axios last year that in sort of closed door meetings with his national security advisors talking about hurricanes, Trump raised the idea of why can't we just nuke a hurricane? And so I wrote a story for the Washington Post about the new bill that was introduced last month. And I was looking for news sources for that story. Like there's kind of the typical experts who are kind of always available to the media, well-established folks who I'll go to and know I can get a quick comment from. But I happened to receive a press release from a small college in, blanking on the name of it, but a small historically Black college in Louisiana that was quoting one of their seniors who had just finished his meteorology degree, talking about why it makes absolutely no sense to nuke a hurricane and how this will do nothing. And so he had clearly taken some initiative, worked with his university press office, and had them put out a press release quoting him as a subject matter expert on this. As a result, I was able to get in touch with him for my Washington Post story, really kind of helping to amplify a young scientist who maybe was trying to get, you know, his name out there a little bit more, help shape the conversation a little bit more. So your university press office can be a really great resource for that kind of thing. And when you have a new study that comes out, reach out to them and tell them, you know, this is what I've done, this is why it's exciting, this is why it matters to the public, and more often than not, they will be excited you reached out to them and want to work with you to put together some sort of press release.
Okay, thank you, really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thanks for your great questions, Nikhil. That was really good.
Thank you.
Well, we're getting a little past time now, but George had a good question. Maybe if you're still on, George, you could take us through that.
Oh, yeah, sure. I was just wondering if you could, of the various things that you do, what do you think provides, the direct pathway to, policy-related activities in Congress?
Okay, yeah. So I do write about policy developments fairly regularly, and there are a few key sources of news I rely on. One of them is this site E&E, or Energy and Environment News, which is kind of an AP style news wire for energy and environment professionals, and they have a whole team of reporters that live in Washington and go to congressional hearings on a regular basis, and who publicize those hearings, and kind of are always out in front on new developments on Capitol Hill. So I read E&E News very regularly to stay up with those sorts of things. A lot of House and Senate hearings are actually televised these days. They're webcast. So if there's an interesting looking hearing, I think there was actually one last month by the Senate Natural Resources Committee talking about critical minerals policy. So whenever I see a hearing that's somewhat in my wheelhouse, and there's lists of these on the various committee and subcommittee websites, what are the upcoming hearings for the week or the month. So I just kind of try to go through those regularly. And if I see a hearing that is potentially in my wheelhouse and interesting, I will, I'll try to attend it if I can, virtually. And what else? I have some alerts set up for bills being introduced to Congress that I think, climate bills, critical minerals bills, things that are particularly interesting to me. And I'm on a number of kind of listservs for information on those types of policy developments from advocacy organizations that follow these things. As far as critical minerals go, I would say Earth Justice is one of the advocacy organizations that's kind of most out in front trying to shape things on the policy side. Mining Watch is also another key player there. And then just when I'm writing about a new bill or a policy proposal, something that's being discussed on Capitol Hill, reaching out to various legislators who are involved in crafting that bill and trying to get them to speak. Their schedules are very busy, but if I give them enough lead time, I can often get a brief interview with one of them. So those I would say are my main ways of keeping on top of things, but someone who is on Capitol Hill and purely a climate or environmental focused journalist, I think would have a lot more avenues and access than I do. So that's just kind of a brief sketch of some of the things you can do to stay atop things remotely.
Good. All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Maddie, this has just been a fascinating talk. So thank you again so much for your presentation for us today. Really, really interesting, really fascinating. And I think we all benefited from hearing your perspective about this. So thank you.
Thanks so much. And I will also say, I know that op-eds came up in the last talk as well. And if anyone wants specific advice on pitching editors, whether for an op-ed or a news article, you can reach out to me. I'm accessible on Twitter, via email.
Okay, great. I think you'll be hearing from us about that.
Great.
So thanks. So thank you, and to all the speakers from the session today. I really appreciate your contributions. I think we're off to a great start with our workshop this week. So at this time, I think I'll ask the CSSM affiliates to please stay on the line, and we're going to do a little brainstorming now. And everyone else, please join us again tomorrow at 10 o'clock Eastern time for the second day of our talks. And we'll continue tomorrow in the theme of sort of impact of the science. So we heard some questions today about how the science can be developed into real processes, and that will be a big part of tomorrow's session. So please tune back in tomorrow at 10 for that. In the meantime, why don't we take a 5-minute break and be back at 1:46 Eastern, and we'll have a short brainstorming session around outreach efforts for CSSM. So thanks everybody very much.